He, as I, have been here at OSU since 2008. David is an intellectual cultural historian of modern Europe, particularly Central Europe. Got his BA at Wesleyan and PhD at Harvard in history. And before coming to OSU, he was at UC San Diego for many years. He's the author of several books, most recently Hugo von Hofmannsthal and the Austrian Idea, Essays and Addresses, 1906-1929, which came out in 2011. Eros and Inwardness in Vienna, Weinige, Musil and Dodere, which came out from Chicago in 2003. A translation of some works by Robert Musil, Precision and Soul, in 1990 from Chicago, and Robert Musil and the Crisis of European Culture, 1880-1942. And also a number of articles. And so today he's going to talk on philosophy and science in 19th century Austria, and talk particularly about Bernard Bolzano and Franz Brentano. So, thank you, David.
Thanks, Anita. Well, thank you all for being here. I think it's a pleasure to see so many interesting and intelligent faces, though it's a little intimidating. So I'm glad I decided to keep my talk short and sweet. I'm even going to pretend I know what I'm doing with the PowerPoint, so I hope that the visuals, this is a very visual talk, as you can imagine, so there will be lots of good visuals. I want to talk today about two Austrian philosophers whom I knew relatively little about until the past year. I told the students in my seminar that actually I should give my talk today on the process of learning the material to give the talk, but that's not appropriate. You don't actually do that in real life. But it is actually fun to think that a year ago I didn't know what I'm going to say today. I mean, not only did I not know what I was going to say, I didn't know the material that will be included in the things that I do say. And then, of course, you know, is that Elie Wiesel, who says that writing is the art of leaving things out. You just can't imagine how much I'm leaving out. I had been much more at home with Ernst Mach. Let's see. Is it the... Oh, this way. I'm learning all these. I'm getting very scientific. Some of you probably know your Ernst Mach. Pretty important guy. Some people have even heard of physics. But I read him mainly for analysis of sensations. But he's somebody I worked on a lot. And then Ludwig Wittgenstein. I guess everybody's read Ludwig Wittgenstein. So those are maybe the two particularly familiar Austrian philosophers. And they're often regarded as distinctive of Austrian philosophy when people try to figure out what that is. If we allow ourselves a broad conception of what is philosophical, I'd also read a great deal of Sigmund Freud and Robert Musil. Get my right beeper. You all know Sigmund, and you may not know this guy. He's a little intimidating looking. Looks too smart, scary. The two philosophers I'm concerned with today, so those are the people you might think of in this context, but the two that I'm going to talk about today share a lot with these other people. Freud and Musil were both powerfully influenced by philosophy and positivism and modern science, and the people I'm talking about today were as well, and they share this commitment to modern science. And one of the reasons that I suggested to Anita that I do something is that this part of the research that I'm working on for my book intersects, I think, in important ways with the kind of work we do in our doctoral program. I thought it might be fun. Bernard Bolzano was one of the most important philosophers of science of the 19th century. I'm sure you've all read Bolzano, everybody reads Bolzano. I once met a painter who read Aristotle before she went to bed every night, but I'm sure everybody reads Bolzano before they go to bed at night. He's a philosopher of science, and Franz Brentano argued a familiar line you may know from Wittgenstein, that the right method in philosophy is the method of the exact natural sciences. Bolzano opened the door on the semantic tradition and on possibilities in philosophy that were later explored by Anglo-American philosophy, while Brentano was an important influence on Freud and on the phenomenological tradition in philosophy. In light of this, it's puzzling that these philosophers are not better known today. The classic and comprehensive account of 19th century European thought which emphasizes philosophy almost exclusively, is Maurice Mandelbaum's History, Man and Reason. There, Mandelbaum discusses virtually everyone from Lotze to Fisk. I'm sure you've all read them. But he does not mention either Bolzano or Brentano. Similarly, Bertrand Russell, who's supposed to know something about philosophy, makes no reference to Bolzano or Brentano in A History of Western Philosophy, although he certainly knew who they were and had taken them quite seriously. Based on this, one might easily come to the view that Bolzano and Brentano were not very important. Before I discuss the significance of these two philosophers, I want to begin with a clarification of where Austria was in the 19th century. I often think of it with Oregon. You've got all these smart people in Oregon, and some people aren't clear where Oregon is. It's sort of part of California, I think. So these things are hard to get straight about, and I thought I would clarify, since maybe not everyone knows where Austria was. I think many of you have heard me discuss the broad outlines of the book I'm writing on the Austrian tradition in German intellectual history, 1740 to 1938, 1939, in which I argue for the value of distinguishing an Austrian intellectual history within a concept of German culture that emphasizes the German language since the 18th century. Not just for philosophy, but for literature and the human sciences as well. I think it's helpful to show this map of the region I'm writing about to recall my understanding of the term Austria in this particular philosophical context. Rather than concentrating on Vienna, as obviously there have been many books about Vienna, or extending the field to the entire Habsburg Monarchy, including Hungary and Galicia, many people, especially philosophers, talk about the Habsburg Monarchy as if it were some kind of cultural, intellectual unity. It was a political unity of sorts, depending on when you get in on it. And then Galicia is maybe a little bit more attached to the western part, but it was really part of Poland, and it comes into this story much later and has a much different kind of political and cultural background. So basically, I'm arguing that this area, which we now think of as two separate countries, Austria and the Czech Republic, really were a unity throughout this very long period. I propose that we concentrate our approach to Austrian intellectual history on the historic core of the Austrian state, the Austrian and Bohemian hereditary lands, which were a unity from at least 1749, when Maria Theresa reorganized and created the basis for a modern state, until 1918, when the monarchy was dissolved. This was the region where state building, centralization, and reform were most coherently pursued by the Habsburgs. I think many people don't know that in the 18th century, the Habsburgs were actually perhaps the most interesting state in Europe and doing lots of things. The French apparently had some sort of revolution at the end of the 18th century, and this was in an effort to catch up with the Austrians. At any rate, this was the area where the Habsburgs did their work in the 18th century, and the area in which the German language was dominant in education and public life. So this was not a nation state, but it did have a surprisingly coherent educational and political culture. The region I have in mind is the part of southeastern Germany. Many people don't realize that it wasn't until 1871 that we knew where Germany was. I don't know how many people are aware of it, but at any rate, this is where Germany was in 1848. So it included this area that I'm talking about. So this area of southeastern Germany was represented in the Frankfurt Parliament in 1848, but then excluded from Bismarck's Germany in 1866. Especially for Austrian philosophy, this framework helps us to understand the continual interactions between Vienna and Bohemia in this intellectual world. From Mach, who was from Prague, to Wittgenstein, from Bolzano to Brentano, from Kafka, who was from Bohemia, and Musil, who was from Moravia. When you talk about Bohemia, usually, I can do this. Yeah, there it is. So it was up there. But at any rate, if you can see on the map, Moravia is usually lumped in with Bohemia. This area was the historical core of German-speaking culture and social life in the Habsburg Monarchy, and it's the basis for my study of the Austrian tradition in German culture and intellectual life. The intellectual life of this region has often been underestimated or ignored. My aim today is not to define the essence of Austrian philosophy as some philosophers try to do, but to draw attention to two important figures of 19th century Austrian thought, and to show how different from each other they were, despite their common commitment to science. Both Bolzano and Brentano were Catholic priests, hardly what we are accustomed to expect from philosophers writing in German, in a more peculiar case because he was born and educated outside of Austria in what later came to be known as Germany. But his impact as a professor in Vienna was so enormous that it's probably right to regard him as the central figure of Austrian philosophy. The Austrian intellectual tradition grew out of enlightened Catholicism, which was more indebted to Kant than is usually acknowledged, but also to Aristotle, Leibniz, and John Stuart Mill. Discussions of Austrian philosophy often emphasize either the anti-idealist tradition or conservative Catholicism, but scholars rarely address why such important philosophical work was going on in Austria at all, rather than in northern Germany. For both Bolzano and Brentano, the commitment to scientific method in philosophy meant rigor, empiricism, and the logic, and the confidence that the work of philosophy is continuous with the natural sciences. Both philosophers were close to the British tradition in philosophy and took some distance from the post-Kantian tradition. With many writers in the more familiar German tradition, let us say Kant, Hegel, Schopenhauer, Nietzsche, Marx rather, and even the Austrian Freud, it can be difficult to extract individual problems from their worldviews for scientific consideration. So you generally have to think of them all as one big unity rather than solving individual problems. Bolzano and Brentano, on the other hand, both insisted on setting out with as few presuppositions as possible. And this patient scientific approach to philosophy almost certainly explain why they are not more famous. Americans have been accustomed to distinguish between continental and Anglo-American philosophy, which is usually taken to refer to the distinction in the 20th century between phenomenological or existentialist philosophy and analytic philosophy. At least since Janek and Toulmin's Wittgenstein's Vienna in 1973, intellectual historians and philosophers have been revising such post-war formulations. It is now widely appreciated that contemporary analytical philosophy is indebted to Central European philosophy, and philosophers like Rudolf Haller and Barry Smith have developed the idea of an Austrian philosophy, distinct from the familiar tradition of German idealism from Kant to Hegel. Some recent commentators have even argued that both the analytic and the phenomenological traditions of philosophy grew out of the work of 19th century German-speaking philosophers, including Bolzano and Brentano. Michael Dummett and others have emphasized the mistake of referring to analytic philosophy as Anglo-American and pointed out that it is more nearly Anglo-Austrian. Figures like Bolzano, who are almost unknown or apparently quite old-fashioned, turn out to be more important for contemporary philosophy than the more familiar figures of German idealism. The unfortunate and misleading metaphor of Anglo-American versus continental philosophy has more or less hypostatized a temporary state of ignorance about the history of philosophy in the years after the Second World War. Dummett argues that the talk of analytic philosophers about Anglo-American philosophy, to say nothing of the contrast to continental philosophy, has distracted attention from understanding the roots of 20th century philosophy. Indeed, he argues, quote, the roots of analytical philosophy are the same as those of the phenomenological school. In any case, more fundamental for philosophy than this geographical metaphor is the distinction between two kinds of philosophy that led to the semantic and phenomenological traditions in the 20th century. In the 19th century, professional philosophy gradually divided between two main concerns: understanding mental phenomena, and securing the truth and validity of scientific propositions. These concerns flowed into the two main traditions of Western philosophy in the 20th century and into the work of Sigmund Freud. Far from being marginal figures, Bolzano and Brentano proved to be seminal figures of modern thought, and not just in Austria. There we go. Imagine if educated people, and even many professional philosophers, had never heard of Jeremy Bentham, let alone read it. And yet this was for a long time, and perhaps is even still the situation with the founding figure of Austrian philosophy, Bernard Bolzano. And although he wrote in German and largely in response to Immanuel Kant, he seems to embody the very opposite of what most philosophers mean by German philosophy. This utilitarian, semantic, scientific, and one might even say very British philosophy. Peter Simons, one of the contemporary philosophers who's done most to draw attention to Bolzano's significance, argues that he was the most important philosopher of the 19th century. Quote, taken all together, Bolzano's achievements mark him, in my view, as the greatest philosopher of the 19th century. Bar none. No one else matches his Leibnizian polymathy of such uniformly high quality. Bolzano has that balance and system that constitutes a great synoptic thinker. And his work has a wonderful, limpid clarity. It is a scandal that he and his work are still regularly omitted from university courses teaching 19th century philosophy, that so little of his work is translated into English, and that there is no good introductory textbook in any language, even his own. There is still a great deal of work to be done on such a major thinker. For today, I will emphasize his contributions to logic and semantics, and touch briefly on his view of religion and politics. Bolzano's most important work was the Wissenschaftslehre, or Theory of Science, of 1837, which did not appear in English until considerably more than a century later, when two translations, proof that it's important, appeared almost simultaneously in 1972 and 1973. As John T. Blackmore, the distinguished biographer of Ernst Mach, put it when these translations appeared, quote, for those historians and translators who seek a major intellectual opportunity and challenge, here it is. A great man is waiting for you, close quote. And I would add he still is, as are the major untranslated works that Blackmore drew attention to 40 years ago. And yet, as great as Bolzano's work was, it was frustratingly modest. Bolzano, like Kant and the Enlightenment as a whole, was interested in the foundations of the natural sciences and mathematics. Whereas Hegel, the most influential figure of German philosophy in the early 19th century, was centrally concerned with history and the human sciences. Some commentators argue that it was as if Austria had skipped the Kantian influence. But it would be truer to say that Austria skipped post-Kantian idealism and romanticism, and that Bolzano could be described as an Austrian Kant, in the sense that he was the philosophical culmination of the Enlightenment. Bolzano was an important contributor to the emergence of scientific philosophy and a key figure in the way philosophy developed in Prague and Vienna. He was the most important logician between Leibniz and Frege, although he construed the field somewhat more broadly than it is understood today. He was a serious, though critical, student of Kant's works, and he had a major influence on secondary schools in Austria. Bolzano's decisive contribution to a critique of Kant was his emphasis on the importance of making a sharp distinction between the subjective and the objective. That is, between subjective ideas or representations and objective thoughts in themselves. And his approach contributed to the philosophical critique of what's known as psychologism. Haller puts it this way, quote, it is Bolzano's great, outstanding achievement to have made clear that the true path of knowledge is not to be sought out and found by way of the individuality of the subject, but only beyond the subjective. Close quote. In the late 19th century, Bolzano became an important influence on the resistance to German idealism at the University of Vienna, especially through the work of Robert Zimmermann. Bolzano was concerned with getting clear about what words mean and explaining his reasons for defining his words as he did, whether concepts or ideas or propositions or truth. He begins his most important work with a consideration of central themes of his philosophy, the concept and the intuition. That this discussion continues for more than 100 pages might seem peculiar to readers until we recall that some of the most important and most problematic passages of Kant's critique of pure reason deal with precisely these themes. Far from being harshly polemical toward Kant, Bolzano may have taken Kant more seriously than any other philosopher of his generation. He referred to Kant as our philosopher, and he never engaged in sweeping polemics against idealism. Bolzano's theory of science aimed to liberate philosophy from Kant's errors, and his lengthy discussion of concept and intuition makes clear how important words and the careful analysis of language were to his philosophy. Bolzano was a crucial figure in the 19th century tendency to separate logic from mental processes, a view we generally associate today with Gottlob Frege and Edmund Husserl. As Frege put it, thoughts are not contents of the mind. Logic for Brentano is not about thinking, not psychologistic in the sense of a process in the mind. Dummett characterizes the decisive issue here as extruding thoughts from the mind. Bolzano's distinction between subjective and objective ideas, which we now know was an event of major philosophical importance, was simply passed over at the time. Bolzano intended his book as a theory of science, which he calls logic in the sense of establishing the conditions of knowledge. Logic for Bolzano was concerned with the rules that hold for truth in general, what he called propositions in themselves. A proposition in Bolzano's sense is an abstract, non-linguistic object. Propositions in themselves are simply truths, true propositions, entities that are known. Propositions are composed of ideas, just as sentences are composed of words. For Bolzano, ideas and propositions in themselves are objective, but not actual or real. That is, they do not exist. In an implicit clarification that he was not a Platonist, Bolzano explained to his friend Franz Exner that objective truths have only the being of being true. He argued that logical statements should be completely general and formal, easily variable, and he developed a substitution test to challenge logical statements. Lapointe characterizes what Bolzano means by logic as a meta-theory of a kind whose objects are the several sciences. That is to say, what he means by logic is the theory of science. Bolzano believed in a fixed order among all true propositions, and that our life on earth will be better and happier if as many people as possible are given insight into the world of scientific truth. His book is an epitome of clear thinking, which the Swedish philosopher Anders Wedberg describes this way: to read the Wissenschaftslehre is also to receive a lesson in intellectual morality. But Bolzano also made important contributions in fields other than logic, and he was well informed about European thought in his time. Bolzano had originally hoped to be a professor of mathematics at Prague, but he served instead as professor of religious instruction there between 1805 and 1819. And his teachings and sermons flowed from the rational Catholicism in which he had been brought up. Indeed, he was the embodiment of what is known as the Bohemian Enlightenment. Bolzano defined religion as, quote, the sum of such doctrines or opinions which have either detrimental or beneficial influence upon the virtue and happiness of a man, close quote. His style of utilitarianism was very much continuous with 18th century Josephinism, and his lectures on religion displayed the same qualities of mind that inform the theory of science. Many historians would be surprised to learn about this priest from Prague who advocated the complete equality of mankind. Bolzano contrasted happiness to the preoccupation with selfishness or purely sensuous well-being, and he found his well-being in serving the greatest good. For those who are not professional philosophers, his lectures on the relationships between the two peoples of Bohemia constitute perhaps his most important and accessible work. In these public lectures designed for religious edification, Bolzano argued that Christ's intention was not simply heavenly, but earthly happiness as well. He added that this man, Christ, was concerned not simply with the inner being of human beings, but also with their external condition. Although Bolzano became a priest, he was regarded by some as a heretic because he worked for the best possible human society. Perhaps not surprisingly, he was relieved from his position of religious instruction in 1819, which fortunately for us allowed him to write The Theory of Science and many other important works. Bolzano argued that the problem with politics in the early 19th century was not patriotism or love of country, but the evil of the upper classes, especially the indifference of the ruling classes toward the lower classes. His critique of class and status made clear that there was only one nobility, nobility of soul. His view of nationalism was also striking in a period we normally refer to matter-of-factly as the age of nationalism, and it puts in perspective the usual assumption that Austria's opposition to nationalism was simply reactionary. Quote, Bohemians and Germans, you must become one people. You can only be strong when you are united in a friendly way. You learn each other's language only to achieve a fuller equality, to share each other's concepts and knowledge in a brotherly way and without reservation. Bolzano regarded himself as a Bohemian of the German tongue who came to the defense of the Bohemians of the Slavic tongue. And there I can almost see his concepts sitting next to each other in a nicely organized unity of objective knowledge. Let me move you on to our other figure. Austrian philosophy is often contextualized in terms of the fin de siècle, of course, largely because of Karl Schorsky, but many other people as well, or in terms of the collapse of the Habsburg Monarchy, as if all of this happened at the very last second before things fell apart. This obviously does not hold for Bolzano, but Brentano is sometimes made the centerpiece for such arguments, even though there is nothing fin de siècle about his work, except that he believed that philosophy had been in a decadent period for most of the 19th century. In fact, Brentano was a mainstream European philosopher of the 1860s and 1870s, more or less continuous with Comte, Mill, and the positivist tradition. Brentano was somewhat better known than Bolzano, mainly because of his influence on Husserl and Heidegger. His own work is likely to have less permanent significance than Bolzano's, but his influence was enormous, including Musil's teacher, Karl Stumpf, who taught in Berlin Gestalt psychology and laboratory psychology, Edmund Husserl, who also went north to Germany, Alexius Meinong, Thomas Masaryk, the president of the Czechoslovakian Republic, Anton Marty, and Sigmund Freud, as well as Georg von Hertling, who was briefly Chancellor of Imperial Germany at the end of the First World War. Since Brentano did not publish very much in his lifetime, he wrote a lot, but he didn't publish it all when he was still alive, we know him primarily through his psychology from an empirical point of view, from an empirical standpoint of 1874. But we do know that he was one of the greatest teachers of philosophy who ever lived. It is evident that Brentano drew the best students at the University of Vienna to him, whether from mathematics or medicine. And those who decided to continue with him in philosophy often made major contributions in their own right. Indeed, we may say that Brentano's significance as a philosopher disappeared into the achievements of his students in phenomenology and existentialism, Gestalt psychology, and psychoanalysis. Brentano belonged to the world of William James, when philosophy and psychology were close together. We may think of him as part of the emerging field of psychology, although including aspects of it that still seem difficult to quantify. Historians of philosophy ordinarily emphasize Brentano's contributions to the philosophy of mind. The great historian of psychology, Edward Bourne, located Brentano as part of a humanistic trend in psychology, in contrast to Wilhelm Wundt's experimental psychology. Although Brentano was apparently not at odds with Wundt in this regard, and some of Brentano's students did pursue laboratory research. Brentano did not have a lab in Vienna, but his intentions were certainly scientific. Indeed, Simons emphasizes, quote, the uncanny sense of direction with which he made psychology into a respectable empirical science. Brentano argued for the importance of psychology by reminding us that our mental phenomena are the things which are most our own, much as our solar system interests us more than other solar systems too. And he emphasized the importance of psychology for society, even calling it the science of the future. Brentano saw himself as proceeding in an entirely empiricist way. But this emphasis on the phenomena of consciousness was not ordinarily associated with positivism in the 19th century. We might say that his most important work focused on the scientific study of subjectivity. Brentano's philosophy is primarily a descriptive psychology, and his aim was to find clear ways to describe mental experience. The English text of psychology from an empirical standpoint is volume 1 of a projected but never completed 3 volumes. In this volume, Brentano was concerned with method and with circumscribing the subject matter of psychology. He carefully considered the importance of physiology for psychology, but he concluded, much like Freud later, that physiology, brain physiology, for example, could not do much to help psychology at that stage. Thus, he attempted to identify what could what could be achieved by psychological rather than physiological means. Brentano argued that it was best in 1874 to concentrate on understanding normal, healthy relationships in the mind. We can see in his approach many of Freud's assumptions about the mental life of the self and others, but it is also clear that the framework he lays out contributed to modern psychology and psychiatry more broadly. Brentano's definition, the field of psychology, follows from Aristotle's science of the soul, which Brentano formulates as, quote, the science which studies the properties and laws of the soul, which we discover within ourselves directly by means of inner perception, and which we infer by analogy to exist in others, close quote. Brentano's other formulation, the science of mental phenomena, sounds more scientific to modern ears and is close to Mach's view that there are no wholes such as bodies or souls, but simply physical and mental phenomena or sensations. If we think in terms of the tradition of empiricism or positivism in the 19th century, let us say of Comte or Mill, it is possible to have mental events as objects of knowledge only from a subjective or first-person point of view, that is, as phenomena, whether by inner perception or by inner observation by means of memory. Psychology, like the natural science, Brentano explains, has its basis in perception and experience. And this is, he continues, above all, however, its source is to be found in the inner perception of our own mental phenomena. We would never know what a thought is, or a judgment, pleasure or pain, desires or aversions, hopes or fears, courage or despair, decisions and voluntary intentions, if we did not learn what they are through inner perception of our own phenomena. Note, however, that we have said that inner perception and not introspection, that is, inner observation, constitutes this primary an essential source of psychology. That is, what he's saying there is that because we have these experiences, we know what these things are. He thinks the only way to observe them is through memory. That is, you can't be mad at somebody and watch it at the same time. You've tried sometime. It's really quite exciting. And so his notion was that we needed to separate these two things. And in a world where people talked a lot about introspection in kind of a sloppy way, he was pretty careful about this. Brentano believed that we can never focus our attention on an object of inner perception, which means that inner observation is possible only through memory. To me, the most striking aspect of Brentano's most important book is the degree to which he established the intellectual framework for Freud's work, though without attempting to argue for unconscious mental processes. He did, however, undertake a careful discussion of views of the unconscious as they stood in the 1870s, when Freud was listening to his lectures. Brentano discusses in great detail the question of whether there are unconscious mental acts. A lot depends here on definitions, of course, but he takes the history of such ideas back to Aquinas, Leibniz, even Kant and John Stuart Mill's father. Although the serious advocates of unconscious mental processes in 1874 were Maudsley and Hartmann, as well as Herbart, Fechner, and Wundt. The crucial issue for Brentano is that it seems impossible by definition to have consciousness of unconscious activities, since unconscious thoughts never appear as phenomena. He does point out that this problem could be avoided by arguing either, quote, that certain facts given in experience demand the hypothesis of an unconscious mental phenomenon as their cause, or that a fact given in experience must bring about an unconscious mental phenomenon as its effect, even though none appears in consciousness. And these are, of course, approaches Freud explored. Freud worked very much in Brentano's frame of reference, moving away from experimental psychology, working for a science of mental life and the soul, studying inner perception, emphasizing the importance of memory for psychological method, and searching for the laws of mental life. Brentano's was a descriptive psychology, whereas Freud attempted a causal, or what Brentano called a genetic philosophy. Moreover, Freud attempted to explain mental events that were not phenomena or inner perceptions. It is oddly Brentano's strict commitment to empiricism that makes him seem peculiar today. His aim was to describe mental events, which is to say events of consciousness. But this did not allow him to describe the mental events of others or to offer causal explanations. Brentano himself doubted unconscious ideas, but such ideas were in the air Freud breathed to a much greater degree than most of us appreciate. I'm not arguing that Freud adopted all of Brentano's ideas, but rather that Brentano cleared the ground methodologically for the approach Freud decided to adopt, including his decision to use the word Seele, or soul. An understanding of Brentano's conception of psychology in his class on psychology from an empirical standpoint would help to clarify the degree to which Freud's work did not appear simply by surprise, and not only in relation to Breuer, Fliess, Nietzsche, and Schopenhauer. Indeed, Freud's work was directly connected to the mainstream of scientific developments in psychology in ways that are rarely appreciated. Despite their common commitment to modern science, Brentano and Bolzano had different intentions in their philosophical work. While Bolzano aimed for the precision of a scientific language and thus contributed to logic and semantic tradition, Brentano's work was grounded in empiricism, experience, and everyday life, especially the phenomena of consciousness. Bolzano's greatest influence has been in the field of logic, establishing a secure basis for valid truth, whereas Brentano's interest in psychic phenomena tended to emphasize natural language rather than the strict mathematical language of science. But common to both philosophers was what might be characterized as an Austrian tendency to turn away from speculative philosophy and to emphasize a slow, patient, philosophical style of philosophical work. And this is an approach that is noticeably different from German idealism. Some philosophers have tried to formulate an abstract definition of Austrian philosophy, usually in contrast to German idealism. But the abstract notion of an Austrian philosophy is problematic in the sense that even the two 19th century figures we have considered today represent quite different conceptions of philosophy. We may reasonably ask if there is a sufficient philosophical common ground in the work of Bolzano and Brentano, given that Bolzano extrudes thoughts from the mind, while Brentano sets the standard for describing thoughts in the mind. But I would argue that there is no need to collapse these two important thinkers into a single philosophical style or tradition. Instead, we might even regard them as the founders of the two main traditions of modern philosophy. Formulating a single definition of Austrian philosophy seems to me less important than understanding where Austrian philosophy was. Where Austria was in the 19th century and how important this region was in intellectual, especially in philosophical terms. For Bolzano and Brentano, what is most evident is the common commitment to modern science and the matters of method and style that accompany it. And the philosopher we might have added to these two I consider today, Ernst Mach, to make up the three great Austrian philosophers of the 19th century, would clearly fit this same description as well. Certainly the contrast to post-Kantian idealism is clear enough, at least for these 19th century figures. At the same time, it's important to realize that there were other kinds of philosophy in Austria, and that even the scientific philosophers, including Ludwig Wittgenstein, could be scientific and still be different from the Vienna Circle, which is often the model that's used to describe everyone. For the historian, I think it is less important to define Austrian philosophy than to understand philosophy in Austria. Well, welcome. Questions?
Before today, the only thing I knew about either of these people is that supposedly Brentano was very influential in the formation of the idea of intentionality in phenomenology. And so you didn't mention that. So is that just because you looked at the Freud connection rather than the Husserl connection?
Yeah, you can only...
Or what? I mean, or if maybe you could say something.
Yeah, I'll say a little bit. I had to choose, obviously, what I was going to talk about, so people didn't fall completely senselessly. But also, I think that I figured people who knew something about Brentano would know that. And the connections are very complicated. The odd thing is Brentano never used the word intentionality. But as you read him, you think right away, oh, okay, obviously, Husserl must have picked up on this. And the connection, I think, goes something like this, that I'm sure we've got more expert people here, that Brentano talks in terms of presentations. And one of the goofy things in German philosophy is that the Germans have one word that describes presentations, representations, and ideas. So if you can imagine how your head might spin reading those three words and then finding out that it's all the same word. And so what Bolzano thinks is that the mind is, what Brentano thinks is the mind is always presenting something. So if I see you over there, I have a presentation in my mind which isn't the same as you, and that's one of the big issues in phenomenology, how to sort those two things out. But what Brentano says is the mind's kind of always aiming at something. So it's that aim, and so when I present something, I'm presenting something. And so that's the German idea, but he did not use the word intentionality. You can see the context of the thinking. And they're very close, and clearly the early Husserl was very much building. And I touched on this, but it's worth elaborating. I think I referred to, one of the quotations I gave was on Bolzano, was that it was a lesson in intellectual morality. And I had the feeling that Brentano was the same way, that he just stood in front of the room and just made sense, sentence after sentence, and that's what really mattered about it. And all these smart guys like Husserl and Freud just said, damn, this is the way to think. So let's have some of whatever he's having. And so I think, then they obviously went off. And an interesting thing about Brentano that I find fascinating is I think the real core of him probably is the teacher side, that it's not a single achievement. But his students loved him. He had such a great connection to his students, and that really was great. The bad part was after they became famous. Then he didn't do so good. And his students all turned out to be kind of, to put it simplistically, more famous than he was. And so then he was a little touchy. It's like, you got my intentionality wrong, and then so forth. So it was a little different. And yeah, that's a whole thing in itself, which I just decided not to try to go into. Yes?
Near the end of his life, I think this was the last thing he wrote, Sigmund Freud. It's about 4 or 5 pages long. It's in the collected works, the standard edition. And it breaks off at a certain point. It's sort of dramatic in that it may be the last.
I think we fell over that. Yeah, right.
Perhaps you can make something of this. What it says is that consciousness is the light by which we find our way through the darkness of mental life.
Sure.
And I'm wondering whether you could work that in.
You could see some Brentano
in respect you mentioned that Freud had a scientific tradition, but he also was part of the philosophical tradition. So perhaps that was, I don't know.
I think that's good.
What happened there is what I'm asking.
Well, let me just step back a little bit from that question, which I think is excellent and probably on the right track. We think we're so used to talking about all these people as German in kind of a vague way. And then we do different things. We discover that they're Jewish, or we discover that they're Austrian, or whatever. But we just have this very vague, amorphous word, German. And one of the things that we generally don't disaggregate is this area. And then ask ourselves, what kinds of educations were people getting there? And I think you can see that Freud got the kind of education I'm talking about. That these were not all just sort of boring pedants reading out of handbooks, which they had a lot of that in Austria. And that's what Austria is sort of remembered for. And if you're a great creative mind in Germany, you say, I'm busy being a genius, and then those pedants down in Austria are reading out of handbooks. But they also had people like Bolzano and Brentano just being smarter than anybody else. And if you were Freud or Husserl, you said, wait a minute, this is the real thing. I'm not going to do mathematics or medicine. I'm going to do this. And so I think in that picture, I've got a joke I tell my students about research that about the guy crawling around on his knees looking for something, and the policeman stops in the middle of the street and says, what's wrong, buddy? And he said, I lost my watch. And the policeman said, where'd you lose it? He said, well, I lost it down the street. And he said, well, what are you looking here for? And he said, well, there's no street light down there. And I think you're right to point at that light. It's almost like you got this little flashlight. And so we're all just in the damn dark, and we've got this thing to learn stuff. And the Austrians, I think, and one thing that's interesting, if you wanted to make a common tradition, that is that Bolzano does write about the phenomena of consciousness, and Brentano does contribute to logic. And so there is some overlap between them, just in the sense that you use the mind the best you can. And so you don't maybe have a stupidly idealized sense that we're all perfectly rational beings, but you go for everything you can get. And I think Freud really had that the mind is a weak reed, but it's kind of all we've got. So I think that's very much there. Another question?
Yeah, did Brentano and some of the later Austrian philosophers of the late 19th century, did they engage or take a position on some of the scientific paradoxes that are developing in the late 19th century, like the electromagnetic spectrum and the various ultraviolet catastrophes, etc.?
Austria has a ton of people who contribute to the thinking about this late 19th century science. It isn't so much these two in particular, so there are a number of other people. One person who does a lot was, of course, Ernst Mach, and Einstein said, we all took Ernst Mach in with our mother's milk. So that's pretty extreme, so not Kant. And so there was a kind of a more flexible, empirical kind of approach. And then as you get into the stuff of the early 20th century, I think it's probably better to look, Boltzmann is certainly one person that would come to mind, but the Austrians, the Vienna Circle, all these people were fascinated with all these scientific questions, and this was just a little bit after. Brentano's real creative period is the 1870s and 1880s, so, you know, he's kind of done his thing, and who's the guy in Chicago who put in the catalog in 1895 that we're just down to the 7th decimal point. There's really nothing left to figure out in physics, but I don't think Brentano was impacted by that a lot, and certainly Bolzano. But the Austrians were very interested in it. Mike,
Well, Brentano's, I thought it was a bookstore, but...
yeah, exactly.
Boltzmann, I'm trying to nail him. Maybe I misunderstood. Did you just say that he too was influenced by positivism? Because that seems a little early.
Who? I didn't say that about. I meant to say about Bolzano. I didn't.
Okay.
What my point about Boltzmann is that for this question about physics, they would be an interesting person to
Okay.
look at to see.
Okay. Boltzmann. So he and Leibniz have a flap over infinitesimals and things like that. But how does? But some of the ways that you were describing Boltzmann, it seemed to me that there's an affinity there, and I'm thinking of Leibniz's theory of monads, for example, which are immaterial thinking points. So I'm trying to see.
Are you talking Bolzano or Boltzmann?
First figure.
Okay, so Bolzano.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It seems like he's in conversation with Leibniz.
Absolutely.
And so he's
absolutely.
rejected, or
So
I mean, you would expect him to reject Kant, right, if he's a cleric, right?
And that's what people have tended to assume.
If Kant is saying that, you know, he's liberating philosophy from theology, and this guy's a cleric, you probably wouldn't want to go that way. So
Well, I'm hoping that what I had to say disturbs that picture.
Okay.
I think that's sort of the traditional picture, in which Bolzano is a fairly boring guy. And who's going to talk to a guy with a turned around collar? But then if you find out what he really thought, you think, damn, we could use a few religious people today who could think this sharp. So I think he's very much an Enlightenment figure. And I would say a truer picture of his view of philosophy is that, of course, he'd read every word of Leibniz. And Leibniz is enormously important for all Austrian thinkers, but actually was for Kant as well. So that would have been in the mix. What people that don't think appreciate most of the time is that Kant hits the newsstands when Bolzano's a young man, and he's reading every word of it. So if anybody who's read, how many people have read the Critique of Pure Reason? Hey, okay, yeah, say we got a crowd, you know. But man, you know, I mean, you couldn't do that in a semester on the old system. I don't know what the quarter what they do. They just hang themselves. So that's one book. And so if you can imagine, Bolzano was one of these kids who said, okay, Kant's obviously the smartest one. He's thinking about all the things I'm thinking about. I'm going to figure this out. And so his answers are so intelligent and patient. It's completely different from the attitude of a priest who says, you know, those damn northern Germans are all irreligious, or, you know. And so it just turns out Bolzano's the best philosopher of science of them all in the 19th century. So, you know, that isn't in most of our freshman handbooks, I don't think.
Can I follow the religion thread a little bit? Because I was interested in the way that you posited Brentano as clearing a path for Freud particularly. And when you were describing Brentano, whose work I've never encountered before, it actually reminded me more of Carl Jung's work. And I wondered if you could place Jung in that constellation of ideas and help me understand how that all fits together.
I can't directly. I don't know if there's a direct connection. I would assume Jung knew a little bit about Brentano. And so, I mean, if you just take that Jung and Freud are best pals during the First World War, and Freud had studied with Brentano, it's going to be in the mix to some degree. I don't know if there was a specific kind of influence. I think with Freud, and this maybe is a little more helpful to say, that for a long time, the big insight was to see that the unconscious was not new with Freud, and that there are all these other people. Right. And so, and that still is not generally absorbed into common knowledge, I think, as much as it ought to be. But I think what Brentano shows you is that even a guy who was basically kind of a rationalist, certainly not doing Freud's project or Jung's project, could see all this. So with his little light, he's up there with a light saying, okay, we can talk about this, we can talk about that, these are all the different things, but this isn't going to be scientific and that won't work. And so he had described all of this, and in that sense, he'd drawn attention to all these questions of the unconscious, and I'm sure a lot of people read them. He didn't go that way, but I think you can't do what Freud and Jung did, probably, without Brentano. And so I think, I always remember Bettelheim's book, but the 70s or something, in 1980, where he talks about the soul. And I'd never really thought about that before, but Freud goes on and on about the soul forever. And of course, Jung did too. And that ain't the way Americans talk about it, because we translated Freud into this sort of soulless, mechanical kind of framework of mind and so forth. And there's no soul in there, but Freud did. So Freud chose that, let's say, the literary, even religious language, the more marginal thing, and the guy that I've worked on a lot, Robert Musil, used this word all the time for exploring psychological life. Musil maybe was, he was certainly very aware of Jung, but I would say that Jung probably knew a lot of those connections. I just have never pursued.
I was struck by the fact that Brentano almost seems like a better fit for leading to Jung than he does to Freud, in a sense, that he seems to share some common assumptions with Jung that Freud may not, in my understanding of him,
he's a Christian, and so that would be one obvious way to make the connection. Jung, was trained in Switzerland, so he wasn't working directly, and I really sensed that the power of Brentano was just being in a lecture hall with this guy, and he's just doing all this stuff, and Jung didn't have that connection. But yeah.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thanks for the lecture, David. And this is back to the question about Brentano reading Kant early on, so on. But when you
Bolzano. I'm sorry. These.
Okay, wrong one.
Anita calls my lecture B&B. I just think it's bed and breakfast. But it is hard when they've sort of got the same name. And they're both Italian, too, if anybody wonders about that. So Bolzano, you mean?
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Okay, but usually I think of Kantianism as, north of where you're talking. Fichte, Schelling,
Exactly.
Hegel. So would you say that the Austrians were just doing a different side of Kant, or were they consciously in tension and opposition with the idealists?
It's a great question.
Almost contemporary.
This is the kind of thing that not everybody even knows to worry about, and what you said is the standard view. What turns out to be the case was that Kant was pretty widely distributed throughout the German-speaking world when he first came out. And so the smart Austrians were reading him and, having the appropriate reaction, seeing his significance. The one who turns out to really matter is Bolzano, because he's had so much impact on the theory of science. And you can't get him right without understanding that he respected Kant, agreed with tons of what he said, but saying, no, wrong on this, wrong on that, do it this way. I think if you're Catholic, or if you're philosophically conservative, or maybe even if you don't like modern science altogether, it's a great thing to say, those Germans are all Satan, and we Austrians are good down here, and we all go to church on Sunday. And of course, that's what the Germans still think of the Austrians, that they all go to church on Sunday. So it's easy to get that frame of reference. I think there are some differences still. So if you take the American reception of these people, clearly the Americans were receiving this standard North German picture. So they're getting Kant and everybody after him. My main distinction would be, and everything I do keeps reminding me of it, that the mistake is to tar Kant with the same brush that you tar German idealism and romanticism. That Kant's still a neutral spot. Here's a guy doing philosophy of science, being clear-headed, not jumping up and down and saying silly things. And so that's kind of like a pure spot. You can take that different ways. And I think the Austrians like to just say, this whole tradition is terrible. But actually, the smart Austrians always respected Kant. To go to the Brentano thing, it is one of the things Brentano does share with Bolzano is that he's very critical of German philosophy. And I think in a general way, across these different political and religious points of view, you could say that Austrians were inclined to see that the Germans had kind of gone nuts in a way philosophically that wasn't helping philosophy. That we're not going to, how many of us go back now and take Hegel and work out all the problems? So you read those more like novels, that you've got the Hegel experience, and you've got the Schelling experience, and you've got the Schopenhauer experience, but it's very hard to disaggregate the things and talk about them in terms of individual philosophical problems, or much harder to. And so I think that's what the Austrians generally are trying to do. But in the 19th century, they didn't do it in the tone of the Vienna Circle, something like that. And it was very respectful of Kant. They did not like Hegel. And so you don't hear a good word about Hegel from any of these people. And I do think a lot of the answer is Hegel's doing history in the human sciences. And these Austrians are thinking the natural sciences. So they have a deaf ear for those songs.
Yeah, I wanted to follow that, your last comment up a bit. I really enjoyed the fact that you disaggregated sort of the continental and the Anglo-American legends, really, of philosophy. But I also want to push you a little bit on, what was science in Bolzano's case and in Brentano's case in terms of what's their project, and it seems like there's differences in their conceptions of natural science and how that might influence or impact the human sciences and the relationship between those two realms of discourse. I just want to.
I would say that the experts in the field probably still don't know the full answer to that question. I mean, if we took this tradition as seriously as we did Kant and Hegel, there would be 10 books on it, right? Right. But we haven't even paid attention. I mean, the idea that most of this hasn't even been translated and nobody knows anything about it. So one has to be modest about it. I think if you take Bolzano and Brentano, I think you could basically do what I did in the talk and say, Bolzano's trying to do philosophy of science, so it's clear what his agenda is. And in a way, you could imagine that he's thinking in terms of all these textbooks. That he wants the physics book next to the biophysics book, next to the chemistry book, and he assumes that all these propositions all line up with each other, and he wants to get as clear, when you sit down to write your philosophy textbook, you want to set it up this way and do it like that. And that's really all he's doing. And of course, he's at a time when we barely had modern science. So it was a pretty big deal, and much like Comte and Saint-Simon sort of saying, all right, now we're getting into this modern science thing, how are we going to, what's our approach going to be? I think Brentano was doing something very different and saying, really, the thing that Wittgenstein fusses about so much in different kinds of ways is, let's take the attitude of science. Let's not see philosophy as some imaginative place where you can say whatever you want. But let's be just as strict and disciplined and rigorous with ourselves as a scientist would be. And that's the way to do philosophy. So he's taking that methodical thing and taking the intellectual morality part of it, I guess, if you will.
And so in some ways, it's a response and a dialogue between the natural and human sciences.
Yeah, and it's just, I don't know, I mean, obviously a lot of his influence then turns out to be in the human sciences. And that's all. I didn't go into that, but yeah, Meinong and...
there's huge literature. I mean, historians of science are, they really enjoy the Brentano influence. I mean, there's been a lot of work in that area. So, and I know there have been people looking at Jung, and I would think that there would be
you think they're really on that? I know that. Yeah. Are you interested in the Texas conference that's coming up? This has become such a big field. Is that the Austrian philosophers are all meeting in Arlington in a couple of weeks to talk about Meinong and Brentano and all these different things. And so presumably there's a whole body of stuff. But it surprises me that somebody's worked on Jung's relationship to Brentano. Partly because these national traditions and these religious traditions get so separated from each other. So if you've got a minister's kid in Zurich, you don't match him up with a Catholic priest in Prague. and you don't stumble across
Look
it.
at the map, right? Okay, I mean, Switzerland is not that far.
It's just 5 minutes away.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, people used to walk this all the time, but we don't think about it that way. And think how many of us know where Austria was in the 19th century. Most of us don't. And what philosophers do, because they're not attuned to the context, is they just lump the whole monarchy in. And they never stop and notice, they never mention a Hungarian philosopher in everything they say about the Habsburg monarchy. And because the Poles in the 20s got interested on logic and philosophy and stuff, then they tried to pick up on that, but they weren't paying attention to Galicia before that. And it was after the monarchy was gone.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the influence of Bolzano and maybe Mach on Wittgenstein, particularly with regard to the way in which Wittgenstein played a part when he was at Trinity College, Cambridge, with Russell and others, in shaping Anglo and also American analytical thought.
I don't have a good answer for you on that. That's, part of this talk comes out of kind of methodically laying out how I'm going to come to terms with Austrian philosophy. And obviously that's going to be an important part of it. It's clearly in the same context, but I don't have a nice specific kind of answer for you of the kind you're thinking. I think there's a way of thinking that went on in Austrian departments of philosophy at the university that was pretty impressive, and Wittgenstein was certainly shaped by all of that. Yeah.
I find it funny that you talk about the tension between the Austrian and German philosophers. And one of the two men's name is Bolzano, which is a region of, Bolzano is a town in Tyrolia. And Tyrolia has incorporated within itself the best of the Italian simpatico and the German efficiency.
Well, these guys, I think I mentioned both these guys are Italian,
class.
so they got a little soul, baby. Yeah. No, that's definitely true. The thing is, they both meant to be boring Germans, but they do have these O's at the end of their name, and their families definitely come from Italy, and that may explain it all. But most of these issues have been solved by ideology. And so people, in Vienna tell a story that suits them, and the Germans tell a story that suits them, and the Italians don't even usually get in the discussion. I mean, they could. I once asked a German colleague my age. His name ended in an O, and I just met him. He's a smart guy. It was fun to meet him, and I said, "Is your family Italian?" He got mad at me. So we just repress that. So there's a lot of nonsense that goes on underneath the ideas. And the Germans of the North are pretty prejudiced against the Germans of the South.
Oh, yeah.
And to this very day.
Debbie, could you say something about the relationship of the church to the academy at this time? Because again, I look through the lens of Germany and corporate com.
Yeah, okay, the fun thing to know about it is the Austrian Enlightenment. And that's what I spent a lot on last year. And it's a kind of a revelation to me how enlightened Austria was by the 1770s and 1780s. And we hear about Joseph II instituting all these reforms that, most countries don't even have now. I can't remember, do we have democracy and freedom of religion? And I can't remember whether we keep track of some of these things. But Joseph instituted a lot of amazing stuff, toleration, at least to a considerable degree and so forth. But that was the culmination of a longer process where the French and other Europeans had a big influence on things in Austria throughout the 18th century. So by the end of the 18th century, certainly Vienna and Prague had tons of these smart people who were in the whole Enlightenment project, just like a Frenchie. And they saw themselves as more advanced administratively. And the heart of the whole thing was the church. They had just taken over the church. They got rid of the Pope, they got rid of the Jesuits, and they modernized the church. And they said, the church is going to do our education for us. And they made the churches into barracks or the monasteries and stuff like that. But it was a completely practical, rational, enlightened project. And so you get that kind of intellectual atmosphere, and that's what Bolzano comes out of. What happens then, apparently a lot of people are upset when Napoleon marched across Europe and beat everybody up. And so when they get irritated about that, they do things like arguing for a pretty narrow view of Catholicism, and that's what came to the top in Austria. And so when in Bolzano's situation, he's lecturing in Prague, and his friends are all trying to protect him. And down in Vienna, the sort of hard right has come to power, and they're trying to get rid of him. And when you get the Carlsbad decrees of 1819, then they can act, and they just fire him. So fortunately, he had enough friends who could take care of him. Brentano, on the other hand, had a much harder time because when we came up with the infallibility of the Pope, Brentano had to sign off. He couldn't handle that. And then he got married when he was in Vienna, and they gave him a hard time because he had been a priest. He wasn't a priest anymore. So he had to sit down and give up his professorship to get married, and then they wouldn't take him. They promised they'd take him back after he ran over to some other country and got married and came back. And so he really had a hard late part of his life, whereas Bolzano had a nice late life, just sat and wrote all his books. But so for both of them, it wasn't easy being a Catholic. That was no piece of cake. But I think we're so used to, all German philosophers are Protestants, right? They all come from Northern Germany, and we kind of know who they are before we look. And both of these guys were trained Catholic thinkers. So it's Catholicism and science. That's what it's all about. Thank you all. Thanks for coming.